Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to knit this circular pumpkin shape. This pattern is actually quite versatile because if you just take off the spiral and swap the orange for red, then you've got a Christmas bauble instead. I'm going to be knitting this flat and I'm going to be using DK weight yarn and straight needles. This is the yarn I'm going to be using, which is Signet DK yarn, and I'm going to be using burnt orange and fern green colours. And the needles I'm using are 4.5mm. There are all kinds of things you can do with this shape once you've knitted it, and I'm going to show you at the end of the video how to use wire to turn it into a wall ornament. You could instead sew it onto a jumper to make a Halloween jumper, or onto a table runner, or even make a table runner out of just these shapes. It's up to you. Right, so the first thing you need to do is cast on 8 stitches. I used a long tail cast on, but you could use your favourite method. For row 1, which represents the right side or the front of the knitting, you just need to do a KFB increase on every stitch. KFB stands for knit into the front and the back, so do all of the steps of a normal knit stitch, except you don't slip the stitch off the needle. Instead, you pull the right hand needle towards you slightly and then take it around to the back. Take the needle down through the back of the same stitch and do all of the steps of a normal knit stitch. And this time you do push the stitch off the needle. And that's 1 KFB completed. You've now turned 1 stitch into 2. And repeat. So do all of the steps of a normal knit stitch, but don't slip the stitch off the needle. Instead, pull the right hand needle towards you slightly and take it around to the back. Take the right hand needle down through the back of the same stitch. Do all of the normal steps of a knit stitch, and this time you do push the stitch off the needle. And that's your second KFB completed. You just need to repeat that all across the row. So knit into the front of the stitch, and then the back. Knit into the front, and then the back. And so on. For all of the remaining rows in this pumpkin pattern, except for in the stalk, we're going to be adding slip stitch selvages. So you'll notice that every row will begin with a slip stitch and will end with a knit stitch. And that just ensures that you get nice, smooth and neat edges along the edge of the circle. Right, so once you finish row 1, you should have 16 stitches on your needle. Then for row 2, which represents the wrong side of your knitting, you're going to start with a slip stitch. You're going to slip this purlwise with the yarn in front, so make sure the working yarn is at the front of the needles towards you. Then take your right hand needle down through the front of the next stitch as if to purl, but instead of purling it, you just slip it off the end of the needle, like so. Then repeat knit 2 and purl 1 4 times. So take the working yarn between the needles to the back and knit 2. Then bring it to the front again and purl 1. Take the yarn to the back and knit 2. To the front and purl 1. Repeat this twice more. Note that it's these purl stitches that will create the lines on the front of your pumpkin. Then knit the last 3 stitches. Then for row 3, you just slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So make sure the working yarn is towards you. Take the right hand needle down through the front of the next stitch and slip it off the needle. Then you just knit the rest of the row. Now the rest of the increase section of this pumpkin is basically just repeating the same techniques I've already shown you, i.e. knit stitches, purl stitches, slip stitches and KFB increases. Therefore, I'm just going to put the pattern for this section up on screen now, rather than demonstrate every row. And I just want to note here that when you're doing the rows with the purl stitches on them, just make sure that you look at the front of the pumpkin to make sure you're putting the pearls in the right place. It's the pearls you do that form the lines on the front of the pumpkin, so just make sure that they all line up. And that's the increase section completed. You should now have 46 stitches on your needle. Now we're going to begin the decrease section, and the only difference here is we're going to be replacing the KFB increases with K2 tog decreases. So for row 31, you need to begin as usual by slipping a stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, and then you need to repeat K2 tog decrease and knit 7 5 times. To do a K2 tog, you literally just knit 2 stitches together. So take the right hand needle up through the next 2 stitches and do the usual steps of a knit stitch. Then knit 7 stitches. And again, so K2 tog by knitting the next 2 stitches together. And knit 7 stitches. K2 tog, knit 7, and so on. And you just repeat this until the end of the row. And then the rest of the decrease section is just the same techniques repeated. Slip stitches, knit stitches, purl stitches, and K2 togs. So once again, I'll put the pattern for this section up on screen now. And at this point, you should have 16 stitches on your needle. For row 57, you need to slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, and then you need to do 7 K2 togs. So knit 2 stitches together, and repeat this 6 more times. And finish with a knit stitch. You can then cut off the excess orange yarn, making sure to leave enough to weave in later. We then need to switch to the green yarn for the stalk. So begin the next row, row 58, with a purl stitch, but instead of using the orange working yarn, you make a loop out of the green yarn and use that for the purl stitch. Make sure to leave enough of a yarn tail to weave in later. Tie the 2 yarn tails together with a slip knot to make sure they stay in place. Then carry on with single ribbing by repeating knit 1 purl 1 until the end of the row. Until you get to about stitch 3 or 4, make sure you don't pull too hard on the yarn because you don't want to pull the yarn through the stitches. Make sure the working yarn is always at the back for a knit stitch and at the front for a purl stitch. Then for the next row, row 59, you begin with a knit stitch. Then bring the working yarn to the front and do a purl stitch, and to the back and do a knit stitch. And repeat purl 1, knit 1 until the end of the row. Then you'll need to repeat these last 2 rows twice more, so you'll have 6 rows of ribbing. I'm now going to bind off the stitches in pattern. So I purl 1, knit one, and bind off one. So I pick up the lower stitch on the right hand needle, take it over the stitch above, and drop it off the end of the needle. Then purl one, bind off one, knit one, bind off one, and just repeat this, alternating between a knit stitch and a purl stitch until you've only got one stitch left. Then cut off the excess yarn, take the yarn tail through the last stitch, and tighten. As you can see, the shape curls up a bit, so the next step is to block this shape. All you need to do is wet your yarn, then pin it onto some kind of foam board or towel, and then leave it to dry. Make sure you pin it into the final shape you want your pumpkin to be. Once it's dry, it should look something like this. Then use a yarn needle to weave in all of these yarn tails. Make sure you do this on the back of the pumpkin. Because I want to make this shape into a wall ornament, I'm now going to use some wire to make a frame. I'm just using some stiff steel wire, but you can use any wire that holds its shape. First, you need to make the wire into the same shape as the outside of the pumpkin when the pumpkin is a little bit stretched. In hindsight, I think it would have been better if I drew the shape that I wanted on paper first and then made the wire into that shape. My method was a bit fiddly. You'll probably want to wear safety glasses when you cut the wire, and just be careful because the ends of the wire are sharp. To join the ends, I just twisted them together like so. I then decided I wanted this frame to blend in with the pumpkin, so I used acrylic paint to paint the wire orange. In order to raise the frame above the surface, I just used these folded bits of cereal box card. Once that was dry, I just took some invisible thread, tied it onto the frame, and then just used a simple whip stitch to attach the knitting to the frame. To make a hanging loop, I just used some white yarn and attached it to the top of the wireframe. As a final decoration, I then knitted a spiral. To do this, I first cast on 15 stitches. I then did a KFB increase on every stitch. And finally, I just did the normal knit bind off. Note that if you want a tighter spiral, you just need to do KFBF increases instead, and if you want a longer spiral, you can just cast on more stitches at the beginning. And this was the result. And that's it, you've now made a spiral. In order to attach it, I wove one of the yarn tails into the spiral, and then I used the other yarn tail to weave into the stalk. And that's it, the pumpkin ornament is complete. And here you can see it hanging on the wall. I really hope you enjoyed this project, and thank you very much for watching.